Okay, let's get into this. December 7, 1941. I mean, it's one of those dates that's just burned into history.
It absolutely is. And for most people, the story of Pearl Harbor is about that one moment of shock, of devastation.
Right, the event that pulls the United States finally into the Second World War.
And while that's true, it was a cataclysm. If you only see it that way, you miss so much of the deeper story.
What do you mean?
Well, when you go through the sources, you see Pearl Harbor as this incredible case study. It's about strategic miscalculation, it's about brilliant technological innovation, and maybe most importantly, it's about what happens when your military plans just don't line up with your strategic goals.
Exactly. And that's our mission for this deep dive. We've got a whole stag of material here, everything from detailed Naval War College analyses to declassified historical documents, even technical reports on torpedoes. And the goal is to get past that traditional narrative. We want to pull out the key operational, geopolitical, and the technological reasons why this one attack was so fundamental, why it completely changed naval warfare and, frankly, American society.
We're going to have to be almost forensic about it. We have to unpack that long diplomatic countdown that, really made the whole thing inevitable.
And the attack itself, the sheer precision of it.
This specialized execution, which relied on some really ingenious engineering, but then you have to contrast that with the massive, fatal strategic blunders that Japan made. Blunders that, ironically, pretty much guaranteed their own defeat in the long run.
And we can't ignore the domestic fallout either, the way it just shattered civil liberties here in the U.S.
Not at all. It's a critical part of the story.
Okay, so let's start there, with that diplomatic path to war. This attack, it didn't just happen in a vacuum on December 7th.
Not even close. It was the climax, the violent end to years of escalating tension. And it was all rooted in one thing, really. Resources. What's fascinating, and the sources really bear this out, is how much Japan's thinking was shaped by World War I.
How so?
They looked at the Great War and saw that modern war was a war of material. It was total, it was protracted, and it was incredibly hungry.
And Japan is an island nation.
With very few natural resources of its own, so their entire strategic belief system was built around this need for economic self-sufficiency, for autarky. They believed they had to have guaranteed access to iron, to rubber, and the big one, oil.
Which is the direct driver for their expansion into Asia.
It's the engine of the whole thing.
Yeah.
It starts with the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, which becomes this full-blown invasion of China. But the real inflection point, the moment they get on a direct collision course with the U.S., is when they move south.
Into French Indochina.
Precisely. Starting in 1940. And this was a calculated move. Strategically, it was about cutting off the supply lines to Chiang Kai-shek's forces in China, like the Burma Road.
But economically, it put them right on the doorstep of what they really wanted.
The Dutch East Indies, the big prize, rich with the oil they desperately needed, especially once the U.S. started turning the economic screws.
And the U.S. response was this sort of slow, steady tightening of the vice.
Yeah.
It wasn't an overnight thing.
No, it was gradual. At first, in 1938, it was just President Roosevelt asking companies to voluntarily stop selling Japan implements of war. But by 1940, the policy gets much harder.
That's when the real squeeze begins.
It does. The U.S. halts shipments of airplanes, machine tools, and this one was critical aviation gasoline. Japan saw that as a deeply unfriendly act.
A direct threat to their military capability.
Absolutely. And later that year, the U.S. banned the export of scrap iron and steel, so now you're cutting off the raw materials for their Navy and their Army.
But let's talk about oil, because that's the real linchpin here. It's so complex, the U.S. has all this leverage, but they don't cut off oil until the summer of 1941. Why wait so long?
Because U.S. policymakers were walking an incredibly fine line, a real tightrope. There was this very strong belief, especially in the State Department, that a total oil embargo would be the last straw.
That Tokyo would see it as an act of war.
Exactly. A direct provocation that would just push the military faction in Japan to say, okay, that's it. We're taking the resources by force. They were trying to prevent the very thing that ended up happening.
So they thought keeping the oil flowing, even a little, would keep the door open for diplomacy.
Right. And you have to remember, U.S. companies like Standard Oil were still major suppliers. It was a politically messy situation.
But that tightrope finally snaps in July 1941.
It does. Japan moves into and seizes southern French Indochina, and that's the final straw for Washington. The U.S. freezes all Japanese assets and pulls the plug completely on oil.
A total economic chokehold.
And this, right here, is the point of no return. Japan was importing something like 90% of its oil. The U.S. and its allies controlled almost all of that.
So their clock is now ticking.
The sources confirm it. This decision forced Japan's leadership, who had been gaming out war plans for years, to accelerate everything. They looked at the reserves and figured they had less than 2 years of oil left. War was now, in their minds, unavoidable.
Which brings us to the very end of the line, November 1941, the whole note.
Right. Japan makes one last-ditch effort at diplomacy. They send a final proposal on November 20th.
And what are they offering?
It was a sort of compromise. They offered to pull their troops out of southern Indochina, the part they'd just seized, if the U.S. would lift the sanctions and stop sending aid to China.
It's a trade-off. They get economic relief, and they get to keep their position in China.
But the American counterproposal, which comes 6 days later on November 26th, that was the whole note. And in Tokyo, it landed like a bomb.
They saw it as an ultimatum.
Worse than that, a humiliation. The demands were just so sweeping, it wasn't just about Indochina anymore.
I was in it.
The whole note demanded that Japan completely evacuate all of China, unconditionally, and conclude non-aggression pacts with everyone. For Prime Minister Tojo, who had staked his entire career on the war in China, this was impossible.
It was asking for a complete reversal of years of policy and bloodshed.
It was seen as demanding total submission, political and national extinction. It basically slammed the door on any kind of negotiated settlement.
So it's either surrender or war.
That's how Tojo saw it. An ultimatum. But here's the most critical piece of timing for our deep dive.
Okay.
The Japanese attack fleet, the Kibutai 6 aircraft carriers, and all their escorts had already sailed from Japan on November 26th.
So they left before the whole note was even delivered.
Just before. The diplomatic process was already irrelevant, the gears of war were already turning, the attack was on.
So that sets the stage. The diplomacy fails, the fleet is at sea. Let's shift to the military execution. The plan itself, from Admiral Yamamoto, was just staggering in its scope.
It really was. And Yamamoto's objective was crystal clear. It was a preemptive strike. The goal was to knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet and keep it out of the fight for 6 to 12 months.
Long enough for Japan to run wild across Southeast Asia.
Exactly. Long enough for them to conquer their new resource empire and set up a defensive perimeter that would be too costly for the U.S. to break. And you have to remember, Pearl Harbor was just the opening act.
It was part of a much larger, coordinated offensive.
A massive blitz that unfolded over 7 hours, all across the Pacific. At the same time they were hitting Pearl Harbor, they were also hitting the U.S.-held Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island.
And the British weren't spared either.
No. They hit British Malaya, Singapore, Hong Kong. It was an overwhelming, synchronized assault designed to just shatter Allied power in the Pacific in one single day.
But the Pearl Harbor attack specifically had this huge engineering problem they had to solve first.
A massive one. And this is where we get into the really brilliant specialized technology that made the whole thing possible. The problem was the harbor itself.
It's too shallow.
Way too shallow. On average, it's only about 42 feet deep. Now, your main weapon against a battleship is an aerial torpedo. But standard torpedoes, they were built for the deep ocean.
When you drop one from a plane, it dives deep before it levels out.
It plunges violently. A typical torpedo would go down about 150 feet before its stabilizers could catch it and get it running straight.
So in Pearl Harbor, that's useless.
Yeah.
It would just bury itself in the mud.
It would slam into the bottom and either bring apart or just detonate harmlessly. A complete waste of an attack run. They had to find a way to cut that initial plunge by more than 2/3.
And they did. They adapted the Type 91 torpedo. Now, a lot of people think they just copied the British from their attack on Toronto.
They certainly learned from Toronto, where the British had some success with shallow water attacks. But the Japanese took the technology to a whole other level. The key innovation, the real secret sauce, wasn't just slapping some wooden fins on the back.
So let's get into the technical weeds here. What was the specific mechanism?
Right, so it all comes down to something called roll control. When you drop a 2-ton weapon into the water at nearly 200 miles an hour, it's going to tumble. It's going to roll.
Right.
Now, if the torpedo rolls onto its side, the horizontal rudders, the things that control its depth, are suddenly vertical. They can't pitch the nose up. In fact, they might even drive it deeper into the seabed.
So you have to guarantee it stays perfectly level the moment it hits the water.
Precisely. And the genius of the Type 91 modification, too, was the addition of these small, wooden, gyroscopically driven ailerons. Think of them like tiny wings near the tail.
And a gyroscope keeps them stable.
It does. These ailerons provided incredibly rapid roll control. They kept the torpedo perfectly upright on water entry, and that stability was the whole game.
Because with the roll controlled, the other rudders could do their job immediately.
Exactly. That stability allowed the horizontal rudders to instantly pitch the nose up, fighting that natural downward plunge. They managed to reduce the initial dive from 150 feet all the way down to about 33 feet.
10 to 12 meters, just shallow enough.
Just shallow enough to run true, right under the hull of a battleship. It was an incredible piece of precision engineering.
And this wasn't just about making the torpedo work, it had a huge benefit for the pilots, too.
And a critical one. Before this modification, to drop a torpedo in shallow water, you had to fly suicidally low and slow. Maybe 30 feet off the water, less than 100 miles an hour.
You'd be a sitting duck for anti-aircraft fire.
Completely exposed. But the modified Type 91 changed all that. It allowed them to drop their torpedoes from higher up, around 66 feet and much faster, up to 185 miles per hour.
Which dramatically increases their chances of survival.
Massively, and the sources showed just how close they cut it. This new roll control mechanism was only perfected in late 1941, after months of intense secret training at Kagoshima Bay, which has a similar harbor profile to Pearl.
A race against the clock, solved by technology. Okay, let's talk about the attack itself. 7:48 a.m., December 7th. 2 waves.
2 waves, launched from the 6 carriers of the Kitbutai under Admiral Nagumo. The first wave was the main event, the hammer blow.
How many planes?
183 aircraft. And their mission was simple. Sink the battleships. They were loaded with those new torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs.
And the second wave?
167 planes. Their job was to mop up. The priority list was carriers first, if they were there, then cruisers, then any battleships that were still afloat.
And even with all this planning, all the surprise, there were still warnings that morning, signals that were missed.
Oh, absolutely. This is a classic case of failing to see the signal through the noise. The entire first wave was detected
By radar.
by a U.S. Army SCR-270 radar at a place called Opana Point. They spotted the formation 136 miles out. A huge blip.
So the technology worked perfectly.
The tech worked. The human system failed. The radar post was basically a training site. The operators were new. They reported this huge formation to their superior, a lieutenant named Kermit Tyler.
And he dismissed it.
He did. He assumed it must be a scheduled flight of 6 B-17 bombers that were due in from California. He just couldn't grasp the sheer scale of what the operators were seeing on the screen.
Another piece of the puzzle that just didn't get put in the right place.
A huge one. And there was also the submarine component. People often forget about this.
The midget submarines.
5 of them, trying to sneak into the harbor ahead of the air attack. 4 were sunk pretty quickly.
But the 5th one is still a subject of debate, right?
It is. There's a compelling argument based on photos and some declassified reports that one of them actually got through and fired its 2 torpedoes at the West Virginia and the Oklahoma.
And those were much bigger torpedoes than the aerial ones.
Much bigger. If that's true, it would help explain the catastrophic damage, especially why the Oklahoma capsized so quickly. But regardless, the U.S. Navy actually sank the first midget sub 4 hours before the planes arrived.
Another warning sign.
Another clear warning sign that was not elevated to the right people in time.
The attack itself was over in 90 minutes, but the cost was just staggering.
The numbers are horrific. A total of 2,403 Americans were killed. Over 2,000 of them were sailors.
And almost 1,200 wounded.
Right, and nearly 200 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Meanwhile, the Japanese losses were just tiny in comparison. 29 planes, 5 midget subs, 130 men killed.
Let's focus on the primary targets. The battleships on Battleship Row.
They were annihilated. Of the 8 battleships present, 4 were sunk. The Arizona was the worst. A bomb hit its forward magazine and the ship just exploded. 1,177 men died instantly.
And the Oklahoma.
The Oklahoma took 9 torpedo hits, rolled over, and capsized, trapping 429 men inside. The West Virginia and California also sank at their moorings. The others were all heavily damaged.
But, and this is a critical point that often gets overlooked, the material loss wasn't as total as it seemed that morning. The salvage effort was incredible.
This is a detail that cannot be stressed enough because it completely undermines Japan's primary objective. With the exception of the Arizona, which was a total loss, and the Oklahoma, which was too damaged to be worth saving.
Every other ship was eventually raised and repaired.
Every single one. It was a monumental engineering feat that took years, but 6 of those 8 battleships returned to service during the war.
Can you give us an example of that salvage work?
Take the California or the West Virginia. They're sitting on the harbor bottom. First, you have to build these massive wooden cofferdams around the holes in the hull. Then you have to pump out thousands of tons of water, seal the breaches, and slowly, carefully refloat a 30,000-ton warship.
And even the ships that look like total wrecks.
The destroyers, Cassin and Downs, they were in a dry dock that got hit. They were burned out, twisted hulks. But the Navy salvaged the machinery, shipped it back to the mainland, and literally built brand new hulls around it. The material loss was a temporary disruption, not a permanent one.
Okay, let's go back to the politics for a moment. The fact that the attack came before any declaration of war, that sense of treachery fueled American rage more than almost anything else.
It did, and Admiral Yamamoto knew it would. He was explicit in his orders. The attack should not begin until 30 minutes after Japan had formally notified the U.S. that negotiations were over.
He wanted to maintain at least a fig leaf of international law.
Exactly. So Tokyo sends this massive 5,000-word, 14-part message to their embassy in Washington. But the embassy staff was slow. Transcription and translation took too long.
So they delivered it late.
Over an hour after the bombs were already falling. The optics were just disastrous for Japan. And the great irony is that U.S. codebreakers had already broken the Purple Code and translated most of the message hours earlier.
But that intelligence didn't get to Hawaii in time. Now, the conventional wisdom is that this was just, a bureaucratic screw-up in the Japanese embassy.
That's been the story for a long time. But newer sources, especially from the Naval War College, point to something a bit more deliberate.
What have they found?
A war diary entry discovered in 1999 that contains a chilling line. It says, "Our deceptive diplomacy is steadily proceeding towards success."
Which suggests the delay might have been intentional.
It strongly suggests that at least some elements in the Japanese high command wanted a total surprise attack to maximize the shock and damage, and they were willing to sacrifice diplomatic legitimacy to get it.
Wow. So the treachery that Americans felt might have actually been part of the plan?
It's a very real possibility.
Okay, so we have this devastating tactical success, but now we have to turn to the other side of that coin, the fatal strategic blunders that made this victory hollow.
This is the single most important lesson of Pearl Harbor, this contrast between tactical perfection and strategic failure. Japan achieved everything they wanted to in the short term. They sank the battleships. They proved air power was king.
But they missed the things that actually mattered for winning a long war.
They missed everything that mattered. There were 3 monumental oversights. The first and the most famous one is that they missed the aircraft carriers.
Right. The Lexington, Enterprise, and Saratoga were all at sea.
They were all out on missions completely untouched, and their survival was the single most critical factor in the first year of the war. If Japan had sunk those carriers, the U.S. would have been blind and defenseless in the Pacific for a year or more.
It would have given them that window Yamamoto wanted.
It would have. But the second blunder, the one that I think is even more damning, was the complete failure to target logistics. They ignored the infrastructure.
And this is where their doctrinal blind spot really shows.
It's inexplicable. They left the massive oil storage tank farms completely alone. The naval repair yards, the dry docks, the submarine base, all untouched.
Let's focus on the oil for a second. What would have happened if the second wave had targeted those tank farms instead of the battleships?
It would have been a truly decisive, war-winning blow, far more valuable than sinking a few old battleships. The U.S. Pacific Fleet's entire oil reserve was sitting there above ground in vulnerable tanks.
Destroying that would have paralyzed the fleet.
Completely. There would have been no fuel. The entire fleet would have had to retreat all the way back to the West Coast, to San Diego or Seattle, just to refuel. It would have taken them out of the war for months, maybe a year.
Giving Japan a free hand in the Pacific.
Exactly the strategic window they were trying to create. Sparing the oil was arguably the single biggest strategic mistake they made.
And sparing the repair facilities meant the U.S. could bounce back incredibly quickly.
The survival of the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard was a miracle for the U.S. It's what made all that salvage work possible. But more than that, it kept Pearl Harbor as a functioning forward base.
We saw the payoff for that just 6 months later at Midway.
The perfect example, the carrier USS Yorktown limped back to Pearl Harbor after being badly damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea. It should have been in the yard for 3 months.
But they turned it around in 72 hours.
An unbelievable effort. 1,400 yard workers swarmed that ship around the clock, patched it up, and got it back out to sea just in time for the Battle of Midway. And the Yorktown was absolutely critical in that victory. If the repair shops had been rubble, Midway could have gone very differently.
And there was one more building they missed, in the basement of the old administration building.
The Cryptanalytic Unit, Station Hypo. The beating heart of U.S. intelligence in the Pacific. That's the unit that later broke the Japanese naval code JN-25.
Which led directly to the ambush at Midway.
It did. The intelligence from that one single untouched building was worth more than the entire battleship fleet they sank.
And all of this, missing the carriers, the oil, the yards, it all stems from Japan's core naval philosophy, right?
Absolutely. The sources are clear on this. The Imperial Japanese Navy was completely fixated on the doctrine of Kantai-Kessen.
The decisive battle.
The decisive battle. This idea, heavily influenced by thinkers like Mahan, that the whole war would be won or lost in one single glorious showdown between the main battle fleets. Battleship versus battleship.
So they were laser-focused on sinking warships.
And they completely ignored the unglamorous stuff, the logistics, the fuel, the repairs, that's actually required to sustain a long, modern war across the vast Pacific. They won their decisive battle at Pearl Harbor, but they left the enemy with the ability to rebuild, refuel, and come back to the fight.
So, ironically, the attack didn't cripple the U.S. Navy. It forced it to evolve almost overnight.
It was the best thing that ever happened to the U.S. Navy in a strategic sense. It was a brutal, bloody catalyst. The destruction of those old, slow, standard battleships immediately forced the Navy to rely on what it had left.
Its carriers and submarines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It instantly transformed the fleet from what was called a 17-knot Navy, because it was limited by the speed of its slowest battleships, into a much faster, more flexible force. It was the definitive proof that the age of the battleship was over.
But it wasn't as simple as just saying, okay, we'll use carriers now. They had to figure out how to use them.
Right. The pre-war doctrine was a mess. Carriers were seen as good for scouting or for raids, but they were also seen as incredibly vulnerable. And commanders couldn't agree on how to deploy them. Do you concentrate them for massed firepower or disperse them to spread the risk?
They didn't have a playbook.
They didn't. And 1942 became this incredibly painful, real-world laboratory. The early carrier battles around the Solomons, they were chaotic. We lost carriers. We made huge mistakes. The command and control just wasn't there yet.
So what was the turning point? When did they finally write the playbook?
That happened in mid-1943. It was a document called Current Tactical Orders and Doctrine U.S. Pacific Fleet. Everyone just called it PAC-10.
And what did PAC-10 do?
It was the operational Bible for the new Navy. Its biggest contribution was creating a single common doctrine. It standardized everything so ships and squadrons from different commands could come together and fight as a single unit instantly.
It solved that concentration versus dispersion debate.
It did, by essentially saying, it depends. It gave commanders the flexibility to adapt to the situation, moving away from rigid rules, and it formalized the structure of the Fast Carrier Task Force.
The mobile striking arm we see later in the war.
Exactly. Typically built around 4 carriers, the new Essex class and Independence class, all screened by fast battleships and cruisers. And this whole system was enabled by 2 things that had matured since 1941.
Logistics has to be one.
Absolutely. The service force, based out of Hawaii, and the Pearl Harbor Navy Yard itself, created this incredible logistical tail that could follow the fleet across the ocean, refueling and rearming them on the move.
And the other must be technology.
Better command and control technology, specifically fighter direction. They developed sophisticated radar plotting systems and created the dedicated role of the fighter director, whose only job was to manage the air battle and vector the fighters to intercept threats. That centralized control was a game changer.
So it was this whole integrated system carriers, logistics, and command and control, all forced into existence by the disaster of December 7th.
It created the most powerful naval force the world had ever seen.
Let's shift back to the home front. That shockwave that hit American society and the consequences that came from it.
Before the attack, the country was deeply divided. You had a really strong isolationist movement.
Right. Polls show that while most Americans wanted to help Britain, 80% were against actually entering the war against Germany.
And support for war against Japan specifically was even lower, only 39%. Pearl Harbor changed all of that in an instant. The sense of being attacked without warning, that feeling of treachery, it unified the country overnight.
It awakened the sleeping giant, as Yamamoto supposedly said.
And the reaction from America's allies was just as profound. Winston Churchill wrote that when he heard the news, his first thought was, "We have won the war." He said he slept the sleep of the saved and thankful that night.
Because he knew America's industrial might was now fully in the fight.
The U.S. declared war on Japan on December 8th. A few days later, Germany declared war on the U.S., and the conflict was officially global.
But that shock and fear also had a much darker side. It led to one of the worst civil liberties violations in American history.
The internment of Japanese Americans. The fear of a fifth column of spies and saboteurs on the West Coast was rampant, and it was fueled by decades of anti-Asian prejudice.
Which led President Roosevelt to sign Executive Order 9066 in February 1942.
Right, and that order gave military commanders the authority to exclude anyone from designated military areas. General John DeWitt, the commander on the West Coast, used that authority to force the evacuation and imprisonment of nearly 122,000 people of Japanese descent.
And what's so critical to remember here is that the vast majority of them were American citizens.
Nearly 70,000 of them were Nisei, American-born citizens. They were never charged with a crime, they were never given a trial, they were just rounded up and sent to these relocation centers, which were essentially concentration camps in the desert.
The loss was immense, not just liberty, but property.
They lost everything. Their homes, their farms, their businesses. The total loss is estimated at over $1 billion in 1980s money.
And it wasn't only Japanese Americans, though they were by far the largest group.
That's right. About 11,000 German Americans and 3,000 Italian Americans were also interned under the same program.
It took decades for the U.S. government to even acknowledge this.
It wasn't until 1988 that President Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act. It formally apologized for the injustice and provided a small payment of $20,000 to the survivors.
A difficult chapter. Finally, let's talk about the blame. The scapegoating that happened immediately after the attack.
The blame fell squarely and immediately on the two commanders in Hawaii, Admiral Husband Kimmel and General Walter Short.
They were relieved of command within 10 days.
And they became the public face of the failure. Now, multiple investigations found them guilty of errors in judgment, but not dereliction of duty.
But Kimmel always maintained that he was deprived of critical intelligence that was available in Washington.
He did until the day he died. He argued that Washington knew about the breakdown in negotiations, they knew about the 1 p.m. deadline for the Japanese message, and they failed to communicate the urgency of that information to him in Hawaii.
And eventually that view was vindicated.
To a degree, yes. In 1999, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution recommending that both Kimmel and Short be exonerated, citing the fact that vital intelligence was withheld from them. The consensus now is that the failure was institutional, not individual.
Washington had all the pieces of the puzzle, but nobody put them together and saw the full picture.
Exactly. They failed to synthesize all that fragmented data and turn it into actionable intelligence for the commanders on the ground.
So to sum this all up, our deep dive really shows that Pearl Harbor was so much more than a single event. It was the endpoint of failed diplomacy over oil and empire.
It was a tactical masterpiece enabled by incredible specialized technology like that Type 91 torpedo.
But it was also a strategic catastrophe for Japan because they failed to hit the targets that truly mattered: the carriers, the oil, and the repair yards.
And that failure forced the U.S. Navy to revolutionize itself, creating the modern carrier task force. But at home, the shock led to a terrible injustice with the internment camps.
Let's end with a final provocative thought, connecting the beginning of the war to the very end. Japan started the war with this idea of a quick, decisive strike to force a negotiated peace. They were completely wrong about American resolve.
They were. But fast forward to 1945. The war is lost for Japan, but their military leadership is still planning for one last apocalyptic battle on the home islands. They viewed the Allied demand for unconditional surrender as a demand for national extinction.
But that final bloody invasion never happened.
It didn't. And the reason it didn't, as the courses show, wasn't just the atomic bombs. It was because the Allies were willing to quietly compromise on the meaning of unconditional.
They recognized that the only person who could order the entire nation to surrender was the emperor.
Exactly. And so they allowed the emperor to remain as a figurehead under the authority of the Allied commander. They found a political path to peace even after achieving total military victory.
Which leaves us with a fascinating question to think about. If a war that begins with a surprise attack and is fought under the banner of unconditional surrender still ultimately requires a political compromise to end, what are the real limits of a purely military victory?
Does even the most total war have to find an acceptable political off-ramp to truly be over? It's a sobering thought.
It certainly is. A deep dive completed. We encourage you to do your own research on the incredible engineering of that Type 91 torpedo and the difficult but vital history of Executive Order 9066.